So now I'm going to bring in Frankie, which is Frank Lloyd Wright. It's my nickname for him is Frankie. Okay, he's laughing. He's just laughing all the things that I was just saying. And we had a little synchronicity happen. I went to the library to do some printing because I'm looking for a place to live, and so I was printing out an application to send in. And I went to where they have the Friends of the Library, which is an organization. I don't know if every community has it, but Washington State has it in all the cities, where they raise money for the library's programs by selling used books. So I go over there to look through there, and this was at the bottom of the rack. Frank Lloyd Wright, Fallingwater. And, okay, so this guy, I mean, here's the back of the book. So he has like a sense of humor. And I picked the book up, but I was going to get a book on dog stories because I'm really into dog stories. And I thought I had $5 in my wallet. So I go, okay, this one's $2 and this one's $3. And you just put it in there's a little thing that you just put your cash in there, and that's how you pay for it. And so I had both books in my hand, and I counted the money, and it said that I had $4. And I go, okay, well, then I'll put the dog book back, and I'll just get Frank Lloyd Wright. So I put the $3 in the donation thing. And then I went back and I looked in my hand, and I thought I only had $1, but I had $2. Now I know I only had $4, but somehow this other dollar just appears in my hand. So then I end up getting both books, and it turns out the dog book's not even all that great. But this book is fantastic, and it's part of a series that was published many years ago. I think this is like a 1996 publication. Yeah, it is 1996 publication by Archetype Press. So there's a little series of these, and they're just, basically I think it's the Frank Lloyd, one of the foundations. And if you don't know what Falling Water is, he's saying you have to go look it up. It's iconic. It's famous. It's in Pennsylvania, of course, in the United States. It was built in 1937, and this is kind of coming out of the Depression era. Or actually, it's still in the Depression era. And it saved his career because he, like everybody else during the Great Depression, especially all over the world, but in the United States where he wasn't getting a lot of commissions. And not only that, he had been involved in a scandal, or probably more than one scandal. And so a lot of people were turned off by him. So he was, so what he started was, he became a teacher, because once you do things for a while, you become a teacher. And he started a school in his home in his Taliesin West, which is in Arizona. I don't know where in Arizona. I think it might be Flagstaff, but I don't know. It just says Arizona, Taliesin West. And he started that because his wife at the time, Oglivana, I think she was from Eastern Europe. Anyways, she came up with the idea. She goes, well, why don't you teach? And so that kept them going. And then I think he started the school, actually, he's saying he started it actually in Taliesin East, which is in Wisconsin. And then eventually they all moved, the students and he, and they all moved to Arizona, and then they built Taliesin. They designed and they built Taliesin West together. And this is where he came up with his favorite color, which is, I think, Cherokee red. It's like got some kind of Native American red. And he started putting it in everything, it seems. And around the same time that he was designing this, which is a house built over a waterfall, I think he also got some other commissions that were really important. And then his career kind of was jump-started. But, I mean, here's a picture of the falls. And this building is still around. It's, I believe it's with the foundation, or maybe it's a museum. It's not lived in by any private people. It is a visiting site. Here's another picture of it. So he wants to talk about sustainable architecture and where it's gone. and where it was when he was doing it. Now, he says he's not the founder. A lot of people will call him the founder of sustainable architecture, but he was actually influenced by others. And he had a love of nature, and he knew that you could build with vernacular. So you could build into the landscape without the building looking like a sore thumb. And this is really actually probably a good lesson for a lot of architects out there, especially the ones who build commercial buildings, because they're usually really ugly. They usually don't blend in, and they're usually like parking lots and litter everywhere. And he is not a proponent of shopping malls. So he is extremely happy that the shopping malls are closing across the United States. And he's saying Canada as well. Because he says that this will lead to something better. Those buildings, though, can be reused. They can be reused and repurposed. And he says they can be used to solve a lot of the homeless problems that the United States United States and other countries are facing. But he's saying that they could have social services and micro apartments, and actually there was some other person who came up with this idea too about an old, wasn't a shopping mall, but it was an old, like, I think it might have been like a Costco building or some big building. Maybe it was an old Walmart building. I don't know what it was. But somebody else, when I was living in Bellingham, had that idea as well. It wasn't an architect, though. It was just somebody who was looking for a place to live. But he believes that you can build in the natural environment, and he says he's influenced by the Native Americans because he lived in the Southwest, and he saw a lot of the adobes and the mud-based, or well, is it mud-based? Because I don't know if it's sand or the straw bale type situations, the adobe homes that are there. And he says those are vernacular to that area because it does get really cold in the evening and it gets really hot during the day. And adobe, because the walls are so thick, and actually straw bale is not hard to build. Anybody can build straw bale. You just get a group of people together. You make the bricks out of mud and straw, or you can use lime or different things. And now you can even use hemp. And you make the bricks, or you make the stones, and then you build the house. And he says because the walls are so thick, it stays warm in the evening and cool. Oh, wait. Warm during, okay. It's temperature that you need for your body. So when it's hot outside, it's cool inside. When it's cold outside, it's warm inside. And, he says those are like, some of them were very simple and some of them were more complex, but he had done some traveling in that area. And he was very much influenced when they were coming up with the design for Taliesin West. They were looking at what else was there, like what was naturally there, not the artificial type buildings. But he says all buildings are artificial because you're building them there. It doesn't matter if you're using sticks or stones or whatever. He says they're artificial in a sense because they weren't there to begin with, and then you're putting it in that environment. But if you're using more natural materials, then it's closer to being part of the environment than if not. He goes, because we're not going to go live in caves. Well, he says some people will, but most people won't. So he's saying that you want to build with the area, whatever's in that area. You don't really want to bring in steel and glass, too much. And he says that steel and glass is actually going to make climate change worse. He goes, because he believes in the wood, like he likes the wood beams. He doesn't like the steel beams. But he's also saying he understands that we can't chop all the trees down because that would be very tragic too, but we can recycle what we already have. He says that a lot of it gets wasted and can be reused, especially the beams and things can be reused. And there's things that you can do to treat them naturally so that they become, fire resistant and fire retardant. And he's saying that it's a myth that the metal beams are more fireproof than the wooden ones, because metal will heat up, and metal becomes like a conductor of heat and is actually going to make a fire worse. And if you're in the building and you've got the metal there and it's heating up, and and it's much more dangerous, he's saying, when there's a fire. That's just the thing about fire safety there. But he's saying that you want to be able to use the materials that are there in the environment. He says stone is a really good material. using the earth things and then having the wood beams. And then so he says you'll be using less wood. And then of course he likes the clay floors and the finished clay floors, and he said you can do bamboo or wood or a combination of, but he likes the tiles. He likes the clay tiles and he likes the earthen floors. And he says the concrete's kind of a big thing too, and you can do concrete in a way that's actually nice looking and doesn't look like a basement or a garage. And some people even lay like vinyl over it. He's saying, well, why would you do that? Why don't you just put something else over it that's more natural, or maybe a natural finish, or there's other things you can use. And he says there's a lot of natural carpets now that weren't there before, but he doesn't like to have a room like with wall-to-wall carpet. He says he's telling me that was something that came like in the 60s and the 70s. He wasn't here anymore, he was dead already, but he's saying that wall-to-wall carpet came later. Before, people would have throw rugs and they would have these beautiful either tiled floors or they would have wood floors. And he's saying one of the styles that he liked was the American craftsman style. He was more of the prairie style, and then Smithsonian, I can't remember the name of that, but he had his own style. But he was very much influenced by Japanese, and the arts and crafts movement, or the American craftsman movement, was also influenced by Japanese. And the Japanese would build very simple houses with steep roofs, and the eaves would come out further, so it keeps the sun out of the house, which keeps everything cooler. And he said one of the worst designs that he saw from the other side was the Ramblers. He says they're horrible. There are these boxes, they don't have eaves on them. And he says the sun goes directly into the windows. It heats up the rooms. And if you're in a place like California and you don't have air conditioning, he says, well, everybody there does. But he's saying that say you were in a hot place and you had a Rambler, you would not be able to protect yourself against the heat unless you had air conditioning, which is expensive. So he's saying if you build in a way that you can alleviate a lot of that air conditioning, you can save on electricity. And he's saying you want to save on electricity unless you're doing solar panels or some sort of renewable energy, because otherwise you're just creating more climate change. So a lot of the heating systems and the air conditioning are actually adding to climate change. He says they're not a huge contributor, but they are contributing. And he says if you could even eliminate the smaller things along with the bigger things, then we have a chance of not going into some more chaotic weather patterns than we're already experiencing. And he's saying that right now we're getting some warnings. And he's surprised like how many people will just ignore the warnings. Like they'll be upset when they're going through a certain situation, such as we just had like a heat wave not too long ago. I think it was middle of June, no, it was toward the end of June. We had a heat wave in pretty much the whole western United States, but in Washington State, we were getting over 100 degrees. And in the western part of Washington State, that's unheard of. And so we were breaking all these heat records. And so people were really upset and going, oh my God, how do I stay cool and stuff? But then it only lasted a few days and then it went away. So people were thinking of climate change when that crisis was happening. But as soon as that crisis passed, people were no longer thinking about it. So they just go about their daily lives. And one of the ironies that I saw, and he pointed out to me, was that people were driving around in their cars because they have air conditioning in their cars, right? Because they're trying to stay cool. Well, the problem with that is they're driving around burning fossil fuels unless they have an electric car. And even an electric car, you got to go, deal with battery. So he's saying that humans are smart, but they're not using their brains. He's saying that we do have the capacity to make the changes that we need to, and we're going to have to do it without policies in place. He's saying that he's a renegade. He's very much, a lot of people saw him, he said people saw him as stubborn and cranky and all these other things. It's because he would not compromise. He was a renegade. He had his ideas, and his ideas didn't always go over well. And there was always people who wanted him to compromise, such as when he was doing the Fallingwaters. He designed all the furniture and everything that everything that was supposed to go inside of it. Because he always did that. He always designed not just the building, but the furniture. And he'd probably go all the way down to the pottery that he would want to see there. And of course, his clients would rebel against that. because they'd say, okay, thank you for the building, but now we're going to put in our own furniture. But he designed, and a lot of his designs were very much aligned with the American craftsman movement. So, you see the Stickley chair, and, some of the things that you would see in a craftsman bungalow, he would have in his houses as well. So he did want to control everything, and he wasn't able to. But he said he wasn't trying to do that to be cranky, and especially when he got older, he wasn't trying to be a cranky old man. He's saying he's actually laughing while he's saying he's chuckling. He's saying that he saw a vision, and it wasn't just the way it looked, it would have been the way it sounded. So there would have been some conduit energy going on as far as the furnishing and things, and how sound would bounce off of it, or how it would bring silence, or a certain type of rug, a certain kind of flooring, a certain kind of wood. He didn't want and he thought that a lot of the furniture of his time, and I don't know, even think of what we have now, was trashy. It was just cheap and trashy, and it did not go with the design. So he wanted the lines of his design to go with the color of the walls being painted, the carpet. It wasn't just matching like interior decorating. He had a bigger vision than that. And a lot of the people that his clients, he was saying, were clueless. Now, he was happy to have them as clients because they were commissions, and it's how he made a living. He was an architect. That's what he did. But he was also into a lot of spirituality. He was into metaphysics. He was into sound. And he said that he built a church for the Unitarians. Well, he built more than one, but the first one that he built it for sound. He wanted sound to travel in a certain way, especially with the singing and maybe the organ or whatever kind of music they had playing. He wanted it to sound a certain way, and so he also had this way of building too, which was very magical. He would build these hallways, so you'd hide the doors, like he liked to hide the front door, and then you'd have to go almost through a labyrinth, or these narrow walkways, to get to the door. And then once you went to the door, you're in this enclosed space. So it's almost like a womb. Or maybe you're on a forest, like a forest trail, and then you're going into a meadow. So it would have this effect, this really magical effect. And I still need to visit some of his houses. I need to go and do a road trip across the United States and visit the houses that are open to the public. Anyways, you go through these hallways, and then you enter this big room. And it's, and it'd usually have high ceilings, and there'd be the windows facing in the direction they needed to face. And then you'd have this natural world coming at you through the windows. So it would be this incredible experience, and it was what he always wanted to do with his designs. Now, he wasn't able to do it so much with the Usonian homes, he said, because those were smaller structures, and those were meant for middle income people. Those were not built for wealthy people. They were built for working class people. And so they didn't have all the bells and whistles, he's saying, but they still had a signature on them. And I think some of those houses, he's saying, are still around, but they would not be affordable now, which is the irony, and he's not happy about that. And the other thing he and I have discussed is there is a lot of greed with landlords, and not only landlords, but developers. And when you're going to buy a house or going to rent something, and this is something that's been bothering me for years, but he's saying lately the greed has just gone through the roof. He's showing me, those things where you hit the bell on the bottom, and it's like a hammer, and you hit it with a hammer, and the little thing goes all the way up to the top. He's saying it goes over the top and off, like it falls off the top. He goes, it's just extreme. And he said if we're reaching anybody, he wants people to check in with their conscience, because it's not the renters or the person buying the home's job to pay somebody else's retirement, or somebody's trips around the world, or they're buying their yacht, or whatever it is. He's saying a home is something everybody needs to have. And that's why he had the Usonian homes, because they were affordable for people during his time. And he's saying there needs to be another architect or architects that are going to do the same thing, that they're going to work with a developer that's going to build affordable homes that are built sustainable. Now, he's saying are some like that, but right now the greed is overpowering everything. But he says that people have to speak up, not in a negative, attacking, kind of shameful way, which I've noticed a lot of happening. He goes more in a check your conscience kind of way, like to be almost like silent compassion walking into the room. He's saying to be not complaining and ranting and shaming and judging and pointing the finger. He says that's just going to make them be even worse because it's going to scare them. And then when people get scared, they get more greedy. He says they'll be worse than they are now. He's saying that you have to be that conscious, just walking into the room and holding that space. And then eventually it's going to start eating away at them. And then they're going to start kind of shifting. And he says there's people out there who are saying, no way, that's not going to happen. He's saying it will happen. But it's like a silent protest. But it's from the heart. It's not from the brain. It's not from childhood wounds. It's not from psychic wounds or, it's not a trigger. It's just a knowingness, a wisdom, such as the mama energy. He's saying it's like the mama bear energy. Because he says when there's a bear in your presence, you're not going to do anything rash. Because even if the bear is being calm, you're still going to be really careful, like how you move around that bear. He says he's been around bears. He's been around, I don't know, his childhood, he's saying he's been around bears. And he said the thing about, the bear is it may be calm and it may not do anything, but then it could be provoked. And if it gets provoked, it's very ferocious. And he's saying, so there's so many people right now that could be that mama bear. And the mama bear is the one that walks in there and says, what are your morals? What is in your conscience? Why are you doing this? It doesn't, necessarily attack, but it makes people more cautious and less likely to do the behaviors that are going to upset the bear. So if you have millions of people who are upset about, he's saying, the housing situation, and they're a silent force, but they're not really being silent because spiritually they're doing something underneath that, he says. And he goes, that's what's going to bring the change. Because it's not going to be protests. It's not going to be like people lashing out in anger and fighting with each other. He's saying it's going to be being that mama bear. And I'm telling him, easier said than done. Because people have reached that point, they reached the boiling point. And he's saying he's encouraging these architects out there, especially the younger ones, like he said, the millennials and the ones that are younger than the millennials that are starting school now. He's saying if you're going to study architecture, look at the problems of your communities and look at the problems of society and then be a servant to that. He's saying don't go and blow your ego up and just do things. He said that he's been accused of being arrogant and having an ego. And he says, fair enough, he probably did. But he's also saying that at the same time he was serving, he was, and then people will argue too, yeah, you were serving the wealthy. You can hear people saying that to him, and they did say that to him. But he said, but he also built for the working class. And he also put out a lot of information out there on sustainable architecture that could be affordable, which any architect now could go and study and learn how to do it. So, and then he did the apprenticeships. I mean, he was an apprentice, but I mean, he gave apprenticeships. He taught architects who are going to be people's grandfathers now, but their great grandchildren and grandchildren can be these architects, can be these designers, can be these city planners. And he says, don't even get him started on city planning because that's a topic that's very dear to his heart and no one ever listened to what he had to say. He said now he says people are going to listen. But during his time, they basically, again, just told him he was arrogant and, go do your own job and leave our, he said they would go do your job and let us do our job. And he would tell them, well, you're not doing a very good job, so I feel like I have to do your job too. So he said he actually said that to them. And I asked him, well, how did that go over? And he said, well, not very well. But, he does have a sense of humor and, and he says that even when he got frustrated, his frustration would not last for that long. And even when he was grieving, and he had a lot of things to grieve, he had a house burned down twice. He got himself, he said a lot of it was his own doing, his sabotaging. He did He said he wrecked his first marriage, and that was very stressful. But then he got involved with his next partner, who ended up dying in a fire of Taliesin East, and it's actually really sad. So he had a lot of burning. I'd almost think he's a Scorpio, but he's not. He's a Gemini. But he had a lot of having to rise up again, like literally things burning to the ground and him having to rise out of that in so many ways. And he was very controversial, very, like, people again saw him as arrogant, saw him as a troublemaker. And he says anytime you're iconic, anytime you're or iconoclastic, or anytime you're challenging the status quo, you're going to be seen as a troublemaker. And he goes, and that will follow you until your death, and even beyond when you're in the grave. And he said that's why he's talking in spirit right now, because he really wants to, clear up that slate and not have this legacy behind that's not true to who he is in spirit or who he was as a physical being. He said he was trying to recreate Atlantis, and he knew that was foolish, but he was going to try anyways. And he's saying there are some architects now that will actually achieve that. They're in their 20s. Some of them are only teenagers now, but they're geniuses. And, and he's talking about his own offspring. And he's saying he wished that they had become those geniuses and followed in his footsteps. They have kept his legacy alive, but they've kept up the legacy of how they knew him, not who he truly was. He said he didn't reveal his true self to very many people except for his wives. But other than that, he had this persona that went way out in front of him, as if he was marching behind it. And so people would see the persona. Oh yeah, Frank Lloyd Wright, see him a certain way. But he said that in secret and in private, he was this totally different person. But he had to be kind of that bulwark, he's saying, that arrogant, to protect himself, because his ideas were very vulnerable. Like when he would be doing a plan or a blueprint, or he'd get an idea and he'd do like sketches of what it would look like. So he'd, sketch the building and stuff, and then of course he'd do the blueprints. And, and he said that while he was doing that, he felt like, like I'm channeling right now, I'm channeling him, but he felt like he was channeling, because the ideas would rush through him like the falls that, he says, like this waterfall that's with this building. He's saying that these ideas would pour through the crown of his head and just through him, and he could work for hours and not feel tired, because he could just feel this energy coming out through his hands and through his being and his brain. It would just come through so quickly. And he was really good at solving problems, which, Geminis tend to be really good at solving problems. So do Virgos and Geminis. And I don't have his chart in front of me, but I have done a video on his chart, and it is a fascinating chart. He's not a simple person. He's very complex, very complicated person. He didn't like that part. But yeah, so he wanted to come on and talk about sustainable architecture. That's really sustainable. He's saying, because a lot of the stuff now is just fabricated sustainable, where they're not using sustainable materials, but they may have a concept that's sustainable, such as, well, we're going to build a building with, semi-toxic materials, but we're going to put a sun panel on top, or we're going to, create the rooms in a way that they're warm when they need to be and cool when they need to be, but we're still going to use these synthetic materials. And he doesn't agree with that. He says that is not what he stands behind. So if those architects are saying that they're in the tradition of Frank Lloyd Wright, he's saying, well, he doesn't think so. He's saying you can build sustainable, affordable, but you have to have the brains to do it and the will to do it. And you also have to be able to convince the people with the money to do it. He says all possible. And he says that the younger generation, they're not going to be compromised. He says these younger architects that are studying now, some are getting ready to graduate with the masters in architecture. He's saying that they're not going to compromise. They're going to be a lot like him. And actually, he said if any generations had followed in his footsteps, it's going to be these millennials and the post-millennials. Some of the millennials are now in their 30s. And so some of them are already working. Some of them are already doing these designs. And, I think they were born in the late 80s to about 2003 is the millennial generation. And then everybody after that's post-millennial. And he says there's even like 10-year-olds and 11 and 12-year-olds that are geniuses that are already sketching buildings, and they know for sure that they're going to either go into engineering or architecture, but he doesn't like engineering. He took some coursework in engineering before he decided to become an architect, and everything that he did in his life was timed correctly. He believes in synchronicity. He doesn't believe in fate, but he believes in synchronicity. And he says that you have to stay open. That's his advice to everybody, not just designers. So is there any other thing that he wants to end with? Because I still have one more channel session to do, and I can get really exhausted doing these because I'm pulling in energy. His energy is really high frequency, by the way. Yeah, he's saying sound, because I do a lot of sound healing stuff, which he thinks is wonderful. In fact, he likes the flute. Sort of my friend's cats, apparently. He's saying sound is going to be really important because a lot of the environments are really loud, like the outdoor environments are really loud, and we need to bring in more forested type situations. He says too many people are afraid of trees. I know I get this too. People are afraid of trees landing on their roofs. He goes, well, then build a sturdy roof. He goes, stop chopping down the trees and build a better roof. Build your houses in a way that they can be in nature without being destroyed by nature. If you're in a floodplain, then don't build your house on the floodplain. Build it up above, or, have some stone underneath, 100 feet of stone or something underneath, and just have a big staircase or some other ramp or whatever is needed. And he says, you have to work with where you are. So whatever environment you're in, don't work against it. He says if you're building a house that's flammable in an area that has a lot of grass fires or forest fires, he's saying then you're in the wrong house. You're not looking at, and he says it'll be easier to get insurance too if you can prove to the insurance companies that your house is fireproof or that it's earthquake proof or that it's waterproof. And he's saying because all the changes that are going to be happening, he says his weather patterns are going to continue and they're going to get more intense. And he's saying so sustainable architecture is going to be very important. And he says vernacular architecture is going to be very important because the things that are in those areas are, if you're in a fiery area and you've got, some kind of stonework that you can use. Stone is not going to burn in the fire, he's saying. And then you can use like metal roofs. And then to soften the metal sound, he says sometimes you can put some kind of, he's showing me clay, but he's also showing me the roofs that have grass and plants growing on top of them, the green roofs. He says that will soften the sound of the metal. So when it rains, and you can create a rain garden on top of your roof, and you can create this, he's showing me all the stuff that permaculture people do. And he's saying that, he's giving 2 thumbs up for permaculture. He's saying that is a way to go because that is giving you in balance. He said there's also some different architecture coming out of Scandinavia. He's mainly looking at Sweden, which is probably more sustainable than anything happening in the United States or Canada. And he doesn't have a lot of, well, he does have some connections to Canada, it looks like. But he's saying, yeah, and to look at what other cultures are doing around the world, whether they're indigenous, indigenous people they're smart. They may not build the most beautiful mansions, but they will build within their environment, and they can build some beautiful sustainable things. And again, he says they might look like hobbit houses in some cases. He says, but there's different techniques and things that you can get from other cultures as long as you're not being arrogant, and that you can approach them in a welcoming way and just say, hey, let's do some exchange and some sharing here rather than we're more dominant than you are and we know more than you do. And he's saying that is one of the things that bothers him from the other side of the grave is dominant cultures going into places of indigenous people or what they call quote unquote third world nations and telling people what to do. He says that's like, parent bossing the child around and acting like these people aren't mature or responsible enough to handle their own lives. And he goes, that is just arrogance. And he goes, they will rebel. They will not take that. Maybe when they're desperate in a famine or something like that, they'll take some help, but then once they get out of that, they will go back to doing what they were doing before. Now, if they're doing things that are dangerous to them, then those things need to change, but that has to come within their own councils, within their own governments, within their own leaders. It can't come from the outside, because he's saying anthropologically and even archaeology, or however you say that, he's saying you have to understand a culture through and through, or maybe be from that culture, before you go in there and start telling people what to do. He goes, because they will rebel. Maybe not immediately, he says, but at some point, because you're going against their spiritual beliefs, you're going against their own leadership, and you're basically shaming their leaders. And he's not talking about corrupt leaders. He's talking about like civic leaders and people that are part of their communities, that have their people's interest at heart. He's not talking about the corrupt dictators and things. He says that's another day, another story. Okay, so that's what he wants to end with. So again, if you are somebody studying architecture, or you are an architect, then you can channel Frank Lloyd Wright. You may not even know you're already doing it, but if you're on the sustainable thing and you're finding books in random places like this one, or you go to the library and some Frank Lloyd Wright book stands out or falls on you, or somebody says Frankie or Frank or Frank Lloyd Wright, or it comes out in some random situation. You're on YouTube and there's a bunch of Frank Lloyd Wright videos that come up because you were looking up architecture. Pay attention. He's trying to talk to you. I mean, that's how he got me. I'm not an architect, but I'm interested in architecture, and he found me. I didn't find him. I didn't even know anything about him. So that's kind of how channeling works. A lot of times the spirits are knocking on different doors, and then the ones who answer are the ones that channel them. So I answered. It's basically telepathy. And he's saying anybody can do telepathy. But be careful. Be careful what you're asking for. Be careful who you ask to come in, because some souls aren't as kind as him. He's chuckling. He thinks it's really funny. Okay, so that's what we're going to end with. And again, if you like these videos, and if you like Frank Lloyd Wright, then support these videos. Watch the video all the way through. Don't click off after 2 minutes, because it doesn't really help me. I know they're long. I try to keep them short, but when these spirits start talking, I can't really do a whole lot. And you have to admit, he is fascinating.